Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our continuing discussion of drug use and its impact on society as well as the individual. So last time we were talking more at an individual level, and we'll continue talking about drug use in the individual, but also some more social phenomena. So as before, we're looking at drugs and how they affect society, how society affects the individual drug user. So looking at the individual, Uh, also, how does society describe drug use? How does it approach it? How does it classify it when that's necessary? And then, in turn, how do drug users affect society? So, how drug users are classified as being dependent or substance abusers or recreational users, casual users, that obviously affects the individual and reflects society's attitude. But what impact do drug users have on society itself? So, we'll get more into that today. So we'll learn about different models of drug dependence. So throughout recent history, uh, the medical profession and psychological professions have tried to understand drug use, and in particular drug dependence. So what causes it, um, and what contributes to it? What factors are important? And what causes drug use in and of itself? Are there genetic factors? Are there environmental factors? The answer is yes. To what degree does each matter? And then this session will be looking particularly at the social phenomenon of crime. So many of us just sort of take for granted that drug use and crime are causally linked. And we'll investigate that relationship and why that's true or not true depending on the drug, depending on the individual, depending on the particular aspect of society you're looking at. So again, we'll look at drugs and their relationship to crime later on in the session. Next time we'll actually get into drug policy and regulation, which of course determines what is a crime and what isn't when it comes to drug use. But as we'll see, drug use can lead to non-drug related crimes indirectly. Okay, so first we're going to talk a lot about drug dependence. What is drug dependence? And this is one of those concepts that's kind of hard to define. So here we see this individual smoking 2 cigarettes at once. Hopefully they're lighting one up for a friend or something. It's very rare you see one person actually smoke 2 cigarettes simultaneously. But regardless, how do we define dependence? Is it the frequency of use? Well, I mean that's got a problem. It's got an advantage and a disadvantage. It's easy to measure how often someone uses a particular drug, but does it qualify as dependence if you use a drug 3 times a day, but not two? It's sort of an artificial dividing line, and it can also vary from person to person. So we have to take into account the effect that particular drug has. And this can vary with things like weight, gender, age. Um, so all of these things modulate how big an impact the drug has. So a person who has 2 drinks a day might not have actually as large an effect behaviorally, cognitively, as someone who has only 1 drink a day, just by virtue of their weight or their age. So it's hard to come up with a single number in terms of frequency for any drug that says whether someone's dependent or not. And again, quantity, so 2 drinks in a day, 1 drink in a day, or quantity in a single serving. Um, so this person here is smoking 2 cigarettes at once, but you know the dosage they're using, is it that a particular dosage qualifies one for being dependent? Again, that's sort of a hard determination to make because of individual differences. It's easy to measure, but it's hard to come up with a single number. Um, what about the degree of control? So if someone has difficulty controlling their drug use, well, that's probably a better definition. So our concept of dependence has this control component, whether someone that compulsively uses the drug. But that's getting closer to what we mean by dependence. But now we've got the opposite problem. Now that's sort of hard to measure. Frequency, quantity, we can measure these things. How do you measure how much control someone had over that choice, or how compulsively they made that choice? Um, So again, these are all things that are either hard to measure or don't really get at the aspect of the phenomenon we care about. So there have been a variety of ways trying to quantify, or at least make a little more rigorous, that diagnosis of dependence. And something that's commonly used in the psychological field is what's called the DSM. And DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's basically a how-to guide for determining whether someone has a particular disorder or not. The current version is the DSM-5. It's just the 5th edition, so it's the most current version. And a lot of disorders, everything from depression to schizophrenia, are classified according to whether the person meets a certain number of criteria. So in this figure from your book, there are 11 criteria, and if the person meets 2 of them within a 12-month period, within a year, then they qualify as having a substance use disorder. And again, this is the way a lot of different disorders are classified, things like schizophrenia, depression. It's not that you have a certain list of criteria and you have to meet all of them. It's more the case that it lists a series of them, and if you meet 2 out of them, 2 out of the 7, or 3 out of the 10 within a given period, then the individual qualifies as having that disorder. So again, it's not something as simple as putting the number on it and saying, well, if they use the drug this often, or if they use this much in a serving, in a dose, then they qualify. It's a little more qualitative than that. But this is at least a step toward being able to determine whether someone is dependent on a substance or not. And a lot of these criteria are things like continued use despite negative consequences. So if you're going into a dangerous situation to obtain a drug, or continuing to use a drug regardless of having lost contact with family members or having lost a job, things like this. So this is one way of looking at substance abuse and dependence. Okay, so defining dependence is sort of difficult, but assuming for the moment that we can do it and do it reliably, what are numbers like in terms of populations of substance abusers and individuals who are dependent on substance? So again, we run into this distinction between substance abuse and substance dependence. And these are usually thought of as distinct categories, dependence being the more severe of the two. And again, we just looked at a set of criteria for dependence. Abuse is usually less severe, so there are negative consequences, but the person doesn't compulsively use the drug, or there haven't been as many negative consequences, or the phenomenon hasn't been going on for as long. So these definitions are again a little bit fuzzy, but we can sort of pick a set of definitions and then go with it and look at the relative incidence of abuse and dependence. So these 2 different concepts, but they're linked. And looking at some basic demographics, so for example, males are more at risk for becoming abusers of a substance. So on the left here we see the numbers for alcohol. On the right we see just illicit drugs in general. And of course dependence is less common than abuse, just because it takes more criteria to meet the standard for dependence. But males more commonly abuse and become dependent on both alcohol and illicit drugs in general. So we see that demographic trend. So we see a difference between abuse and dependence, also a difference between males and females. So those give us some general idea. And of course, the difference between alcohol and illicit drugs in general is because of the difference in the frequency of use. So alcohol is a lot more commonly used than other illicit drugs. And so it's more commonly abused, and it's more commonly a source of dependence. So we talked about this last time, about taking into account the frequency of use in a substance when we're assessing how dangerous it is, or how likely it is to lead to dependence or addiction. Okay, so we have this sort of loose definition of dependence. What are some processes that seem to be involved consistently in drug dependence? Well, one is tolerance, and we talked about this last week. So tolerance is the phenomenon uh, by which a given dose of drug taken repeatedly over time doesn't produce the same physiological or behavioral effect. Stated another way, it takes progressively more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect. So you can look at it either way. But again, this came up during our unit on the brain and drugs' effects on the brain. So as more and more of the drug is taken, the brain basically becomes used to taking that drug. It gets used to that drug being present at various levels in the system. So if it's present, then the brain might take away some of those receptors so that the neuron isn't as sensitive to the drug anymore. So now it takes proportionally more of the drug to have the same effect on those neurons because they have fewer receptors sitting on their postsynaptic membranes that can receive the drug. And so that's why we talked about drugs in the brain first. So now talking about dependence and the individual, we can understand how tolerance comes about. It's no longer a nebulous concept. So our brains, our neurons, get used to a substance. And so by virtue of changing the number of receptors that are present, it takes more of the drug to get the same effect on the neurons. There's also the concept of physical dependence, and this is usually defined and determined by the presence of withdrawal symptoms. So this is physical or physiological dependence, where the body itself requires the presence of the drug in order to function normally. And withdrawal occurs across a variety of drugs. The most commonly known are things like the opioids, so heroin withdrawal or morphine withdrawal. So as the person becomes dependent and physically dependent on the drug, then they need the drug to function normally, physiologically. So if the person becomes dependent on painkillers, on opioids in particular, then as soon as they stop the drug, instead of having the drug in their system, now the drug is gone, and now they're, for example, more sensitive to pain. Opioids are pain-killing agents, as we'll discuss in a couple of weeks. So without the drugs present in the system, now the brain is sort of compensating for a drug that's no longer there. Also things like fluid loss, particularly diarrhea, are common after someone who's dependent on opioids goes off of opioids. So morphine, heroin, these things all cause what's called opioid-dependent constipation, because in addition to killing pain, they also change the motility, the degree of movement in the intestines. And so once the body gets used to that, then the brain and the digestive system are compensating for the fact that there are all these opioids floating around in the system. But once those are gone, now it takes a while for the body to adjust. As the body now is compensating for a drug that's no longer there. Same thing happens with alcohol. Alcohol generally depresses the nervous system, makes it less active. So someone who becomes dependent on alcohol severely, if that alcohol is suddenly cut off, now their nervous system becomes hyperactive in a sense. So you'll get things like seizures, which result from having an overly active nervous system in general. And so the brain is now compensating for the usual depressive effects of alcohol, but that alcohol is now suddenly gone, and the brain becomes hyperactive because it's compensating for a drug that's no longer present. So withdrawal is one of the main markers for physical dependence. There's also psychological dependence. And here the concept of reinforcement comes into play. So the idea that drugs are reinforcing, and this is the concept that's come up before, and we defined reinforcement as sort of operationally as something, a drug is reinforcing if it causes drug taking to become more likely. Well, that's a little statistical, so to put it more bluntly, if it creates a pleasurable sensation, if it has positive effects, then that's reinforcing. We're hardwired to seek out pleasure, avoid punishment, and so the substance, if it reinforces the behavior, it creates a pleasant sensation, if it's a positive effect, then we're more likely to take it in the future. So over the course of medical history, there have been different models of dependence. So how does someone become dependent? What determines whether an individual will become dependent or not on a drug? And first, there were sort of moral models, the idea that drug users and individuals that were dependent on a drug were weak-willed or were hedonists seeking to get high. Um, and so that's one of the first models that was come up, that was devised, was this sort of moral model. There are people that are morally strong and avoid being drug users, and there are people that are morally weak in some sense, uh, that avoid, or sorry, that seek out drugs. Um, and of course, that has some problems with it. First, it's very hard to determine at the beginning who is morally weak and who's morally strong, because it becomes sort of circular in the sense that, well, who's morally weak? Well, drug users. Well, why is this person a drug user? Oh, because they're morally weak. So it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. So that's not a very good way of describing drug users, and it doesn't have very much predictive value. So it's a very good model. There were also withdrawal avoidance models, and this comes from the physical dependence concept, um, or aspect of dependence. So the idea that someone starts taking a drug, they become dependent on it, because if they stop taking it, they'll experience these withdrawal symptoms. So the idea that the repetitive drug user is really just taking the drug to avoid those withdrawal symptoms. And that was sort of a better model. That was an improvement. It at least had a more causal link as opposed to the circular one of the moral models. But the problem is that the experimental evidence suggested that an individual, and of course a lot of these were animal experiments, that an individual doesn't need to ever have experienced withdrawal to continue taking a drug. If you allow them free access to a drug, they'll keep on taking it. They've never experienced withdrawal, and yet they'll, by any reasonable measure, be dependent on the substance. So they'll work for it. They'll go through a hazardous situation. They'll forego resources in order to get the drug, even though they've never experienced withdrawal symptoms. So it can't be that withdrawal is a deterrent for that individual. What's currently thought to be the most plausible model is the positive reinforcement model. And that is emphasizing these reinforcing aspects of the drug, the pleasant ones. Now, which is not to say that there isn't a component of withdrawal avoidance, but again, experimental evidence suggests that positive reinforcement seems to be the biggest player. And when we talk about positive reinforcement, it's hard to talk about positive reinforcement and the brain without talking about dopamine. So dopamine, we've already mentioned many times, it's one of the important neurotransmitters in the brain. It's not the most common. Glutamate, as we know, is the most common excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, is the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter, and those are both more common than dopamine. But nevertheless, dopamine is very important. And one of the early pieces of work that was done on dopamine was doing electrode recordings. So that is, you can stick an electrode in a particular area of the brain that has dopamine neurons and record from those neurons, that is, detect the level of dopamine present, and you can see when the dopamine neurons are firing. You can see what they respond to. What sort of stimulus do dopamine neurons respond to? And so again, this is done electrode recordings. And one of the things that was discovered fairly quickly was that certain drugs, particularly drugs of abuse, that is, drugs that are likely to lead to dependence, seem to initiate dopamine release. And so dopamine would be released into the synapses shortly after cocaine was administered, for example. And so that's what's shown here in the figure in the bottom left, is if you allow, in this case, a rat to press a lever and directly release cocaine into the brain, then you see this increase in dopamine levels. So it seems to be that dopamine release is a response to the administration of drugs. And in the beginning, this was thought to be evidence that dopamine was sort of the pleasure chemical, or the reward neurotransmitter. that's true to a certain extent, but as with most things, the early theories were overly simplistic. And now dopamine seems to be involved in controlling movement, but also in learning. So it's thought that dopamine doesn't necessarily explicitly represent reward. Not that anytime something rewarding happens, I'll get dopamine release. I can get something negative like pain, and I'll still get dopamine release. Um, so saying that it's equal to reward isn't quite right. It's perhaps more accurate, we currently think, to say that dopamine is released when there's something to be learned. And so when cocaine is administered, again, that has effects on the brain that are interpreted as being pleasurable. And so dopamine is released, it's thought, in order to learn what caused that pleasurable sensation, to learn what caused that positive reinforcement. The brain's always sort of seeking out positive reinforcement. What behaviors should I initiate in order to get as much positive reinforcement as I can get? And so when dopamine is released, it seems to be very important for learning. So we're trying to learn the association between an environment or an action and whatever caused that positive reinforcement. So this gets us to an interesting issue. And that is, if we look at the dopamine system runs throughout the frontal lobe of the brain, but it originates in the midbrain. And in two structures called the substantia nigra, which we've already mentioned with reference to Parkinson's disease. That's in Parkinson's, the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra are what die and cause the symptoms of Parkinson's. But there's also a structure called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. And this does seem to be sort of the brain's pleasure and learning center. That whenever the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, is active, those behaviors tend to be repeated. So whatever was going on in the environment or in the individual, when neurons in the VTA started becoming active, that seems to be reinforced. The environment seems to be reinforced. The person or animal will seek out that environment, or the person or animal will repeat the behavior. And so it's these dopamine neurons from the VTA that do what we call project. That is, the axons are distributed throughout the frontal cortex. So the thing is, and here's the interesting issue, is that other things cause dopamine release too. So if we're using dopamine release as our marker for what's addictive, that is what the brain is trying to learn to associate with positive reinforcement, well, now we've got this interesting issue that things that other drugs, but things that aren't even drugs cause dopamine release. So things like sex, certain foods, even things like exercise, video games, gambling. These things can all cause dopamine release. And so these are positive reinforcers, and they can happen unexpectedly. So they're hard to predict. And so this learning component of dopamine is thought to be really dedicated to predicting the world around us. And in this case, predicting what's going to be positively reinforcing. So the issue is this. If things other than drugs are positively reinforcing in this way and initiate dopamine release in the same way that addicting drugs do, are these activities addicting? So we have concepts that are relatively recent, like sex addiction, gambling addiction, video game addiction. Are these legitimate addictions? It's sort of an open question. And even people in the psychological community, some say yes and some say no. So they do share certain properties, but they are not chemicals, they're not drugs. So the debate rages on whether events, whether activities can be addicting, or at least addicting in the same sense that drugs are. So that's the big question. Are these events, these non-drug phenomena, are they addicting? And should we label them as such? Okay, so now we have this sort of operational definition of dependence. Again, sort of a set of criteria. And we have different processes that are involved in dependence. Now we can look at whether dependence evolves for particular drugs. So which drugs seem to be more associated with eventually developing dependence? And so we have this table here from your book. And one thing to keep in mind in this table is that this is not the chance that you'll become dependent just as a random individual in the population. This is given that you've been using the drug for 1 year or 10 years, or for your entire life, more or less. Uh, what's the likelihood you will qualify as being dependent on it? So these statistics are predicated upon use for a year or 10 years or a lifetime. This is not the chance that the average individual will become dependent. And what you'll notice about this table is that the estimates are different for different drugs. So it's not that all drugs are equally likely to produce dependence in people who use them. So as we see, after 1 year of use, 7% of people who've been using cocaine for the last year qualify as being dependent, whereas only 2% for other drugs like alcohol, nicotine, marijuana. So cocaine seems to be uh, more addicting. Again, I'm not going to differentiate between addiction and dependence right now. Um, but cocaine seems to initiate dependence more easily in those early stages than these other drugs do. But you can also notice that over the lifetime of a person, that nicotine is the most likely to produce dependence. And this is probably not surprising. People who've been smoking for a very, very long time have a hard time quitting. Uh, so cocaine seems to be the most likely to cause dependence after 1 year of use, but nicotine seems to be most likely to cause dependence after a much longer term of use, even after 10 years, as you can see from this table. So again, the idea here is that different drugs cause, or at least are associated with dependence to varying degrees depending on the drug. Now, of course, there are other factors as well that are environmental or genetic, and we'll talk about those here in a minute. But it's not the case that all drugs are equally likely uh, to initiate dependence on the part of the user. So now we can start talking about causes of drug use and eventual dependence. So we've talked about this some already, genetic influences. So to what degree do our genes predispose us toward drug use and toward drug dependence? And one of the most useful ways of getting at this question are twin studies. And what twin studies are, they're a way of looking at the relative impact of genetic and environmental influences. So twins are usually raised in the same environment, but they can share different degrees of their genetic material. So what are called heterozygotic or dizygotic twins, what we usually call fraternal twins, share on average half of their genes. Whereas identical twins, monozygotic twins, share 100% of their genetic material. They are genetically identical. They are, in a sense, nature's clones. So they have the exact same genetic material. And the question is, if a set of fraternal twins is raised in the same environment, what is the correlation if one of them develops drug use or drug dependence? Uh, what is the likelihood the other one will develop it as well? We can ask that question for fraternal twins. We can also ask it for identical twins. And so if the incidence is higher, if the correlation, the link between them is higher for identical twins, well, the identical twins, if they have a tighter link in terms of their likelihood of developing drug dependence, they also have a tighter link in terms of their genetic similarity. They're 100% similar. And so twin studies are a good way of looking at the relative impact of genetic and environmental influences. And depending on the drug, numbers are often run around 30, 50% for the genetic impact. So if one twin, an identical twin, develops drug dependence, they are far more likely it's far more likely for the other twin to develop dependence as well than some other randomly selected individual or a sibling that's not genetically identical, even in the same environment. So there is a genetic component. One of the big concepts in dependence and addiction is the idea of the addictive personality. And this has already been brought up in discussion group, for example. So does this exist? Is this a real phenomenon? Well, yes and no. So It's not that there is a single kind of personality that we define as addictive. It's not a personality type in the sense that you're an extrovert or an introvert. Drug addict is not a personality type. However, there are certain personality measures that are correlated with the likelihood of using drugs or becoming dependent on drugs. One of these is sensation seeking, what's also called novelty seeking. Colloquially, this is often referred to as a thrill-seeking personality. So someone who's seeking out and willing to try new experiences, but particularly less sensitive to the hazards of new experiences. So, for example, this personality metric correlates with people who skydive. So people who engage in skydiving, on average, have a higher value for this metric than people who choose not to engage in skydiving. So it's not just drug use, it's a variety of behaviors. But all put together, they all seem to emphasize uh, the seeking out of new sensations, of new experiences, uh, with less regard for the hazards or dangers associated with those experiences. And that makes sense for if you're looking for individuals more likely to try drugs. Well, who's more likely to try them? Someone who's interested in seeking a new experience and isn't as worried about the potential dangers of the drug. There's also a link to what's called impulsivity. Historically, this is a component of what was called psychoticism, but impulsivity is a little more specific and not quite as stigmatized. So impulsivity reflects how much the individual weighs the immediate versus the future. So if they're more worried about immediate gains or immediate experiences and not as worried about the long-term consequences of behavior, then they're high on impulsivity, and these individuals are more likely to try drugs, more likely to become dependent on them eventually. Of course, there are also environmental influences. Things like the family environment, the social environment. We've already talked about this to a certain degree as well. We know that environment can have an impact. How available a drug is in your environment, whether your parents condone or discourage drug use, whether your peer group encourages or discourages drug use. Um, so these are all factors in whether a person will start using a drug and become eventually dependent. Which is not to say that 100% of people become dependent. As we saw in the previous table, for many drugs, actually a very small percentage become dependent according to our criteria. So if we're looking for causes or factors that contribute to drug use, we have all of these things. We have genetics, we have personality, which may have a genetic component as well. We have environmental influences. So all these things increase or decrease the likelihood that the person will try a particular drug. So often, and particularly for drugs like alcohol, dependence has been framed as a disease. So the question is it a disease? Um, so it does share some attributes, and historically the reason this was first framed as a disease is because initially, to a certain degree, dependence was treated as a symptom, that someone had a personality disorder, or again, according to the moral model, was morally weak in some way. And so, um, so substance dependence was thought of as a symptom, as opposed to a primary problem. And so psychologists, doctors would try to treat what they thought were the root cause of the substance dependence, as opposed to the dependence itself. So that's one thing that it does share is substance dependence seems to be a primary problem. It is not the result of a particular personality type. It is not the result of other psychological disorders. You can have no psychological disorders whatsoever and still become substance dependent. So it also shares attributes like transmissibility. Not in a direct sense, of course. You can't become dependent on a drug just by being around people who are. But the likelihood of drug use, and therefore the likelihood of eventual dependence, does vary from environment to environment. So if your environment, if you're in contact with individuals who use a particular drug, you're more likely to use it yourself. So in a rough sense, it is sort of transmissible in a way that diseases are. But it's not like a disease in other respects. So in one, the most important is that there's no cut and dry test for dependence. As we've already seen, it's more a collection of criteria, and that's the best we can do right now. Now maybe eventually there will be a biological test, hard to say. But right now there is no test like there is for tuberculosis or cancer. So it's not a disease in that sense, that it has a definite set of symptoms that can be readily identified using a set of scientific examinations. So is it a disease? It's fair to say it's like a disease, but is it a disease? Some people say yes, some people say no. Okay, now we're going to move into drugs and drug users' effect on society, and we're going to focus on crime in this particular portion of our session. So historically, the relationship was thought of as very simple. The drug use causes crime, and this is evident um, in, uh, in media up to the 20th century, but also in the 20th century as well. So media presents the drug user as inevitably becoming dependent, as inevitably becoming criminal. So in this sense, using a drug immediately makes a person engage in criminal behavior. And we know now this isn't a very reasonable portrayal. In fact, it seems sort of silly to us now. Uh, but at the time, that was the attitude. Now that said, um, what is meant there with that original sentiment is that drug use, when someone is under the influence of a drug, they are more likely or that they inevitably become criminals. Um, Now it's true that some drugs, for some individuals, can cause things like aggressive behavior, it seems. Again, there's a lot of variability. It's not inevitable. And so for violent crime, for example, certain drugs like alcohol, PCP, both of which we'll talk in depth about later on in the course, these are associated with aggressive or violent behavior. Uh, but again, that causal link isn't really airtight. They're associated, but as we've already said, correlation does not imply causation. It's very hard to establish cause. Um, but nevertheless, for some individuals and some drugs, aggressive, violent behaviors are associated with use of those drugs. But there are other ways that we can describe the relationship between drugs and criminal behavior. So drug use and criminal behavior have common risk factors. So education, socioeconomic status, for example, both are associated with criminal behavior and drug use. Being involved in a subculture that approves of drug use tends to approve of certain criminal behaviors as well. Uh, so there are environmental factors, as we've already discussed, that seem to encourage or allow drug use, and also criminal behavior. So is it the case that drugs cause the crime? Not really in this case. It's more accurate to say that a given set of factors causes both drug use and criminal behavior. And that's why we see a correlation between drug use and criminal behavior, is because we have some other environmental or genetic factor that's causing both. Of course, we shouldn't ignore the fact that drugs are an economic force as well. And I mean this in two different senses. One is that as a drug user, drugs are rarely given out for free. They cost money, especially illicit drugs. And so in order to obtain them, you need money. And if you're spending all your money on drugs already or other things, um, you need a new source of income. And so drug use can drive criminal behavior in that sense, not in terms of a direct effect of drug use, not that the physiological or behavioral effects of using the drug itself are causing the crime, but even when the person is not using the drug, even when the drug is not resident in the person's system, the person might still be more likely to commit a crime just in order to get money or resources in order to obtain more of the drug. The second sense in which drugs are an economic force are, of course, that especially for illicit drugs, uh, that you can have multiple organizations that are distributing and selling the same illicit drug. And so you can have violent behavior, you can have criminally violent individuals as a result of competition over the drug market. So drugs are an economic force for the individual drug user, but they're also an economic force for those that are distributing the drugs. And of course, distributing the drug can be itself a criminal act, but the other behaviors associated with drug distribution can also be criminal. And of course, using the drug itself can also be a crime. So in that sense, the link is very direct. And that's a function of our drug regulations, and that varies from country to country. But when using a drug is a crime, well, of course, the drug use and crime are related. Whether the person gets caught or not is a separate issue, of course. But if you can't use the drug without committing a crime, then that link is inevitable. Okay, so these are all just some things to think about when we think about drugs and the relationship between drugs and crime. It's not as simple as, well, people who use drugs, when they're under the influence, they commit crimes. Sometimes they do, but not always, and it depends on the drug. Again, especially things like depressants or opioids, marijuana. These are less associated with criminal behavior, but obtaining them or obtaining the money to buy them, that can be associated with criminal behavior. Okay, so that is it for this week's discussion of drug use in society. Next time we're going to talk about drug policy and regulations around drugs and drug use. So we'll talk about things like the history of drug regulation in the United States. So in the first week, we talked about the history of drugs, beginning in ancient times and moving up toward the late 1800s, more or less. Now we'll sort of cover that gap. So we'll get us from the late 1800s up to the present day in the coming week. We'll also talk about what our current regulations are. So what were they intended to do? What are the regulations? What effects are they intended to produce? What effects do they actually produce? And how are these things enforced? So how do we enforce drug regulations? How effective are those regulations? And so that will be our topic for next week, and I will see you all then.